So, from going through the interviews with some of Sterns' former friends, I found myself pretty much compelled to grab this interview from Hidden True Crime and go back through it with all the knowledge that we've gained from Sterns' friends. Are they genuine? I think the 3 interviews that I've listened to definitely sound genuine. We don't know if there's any exaggerations in what they're saying, but certainly what I want to do in this video and in subsequent ones, because the Hidden True Crime interview is actually 2 hours long, so for me to do a full rundown of that, it's going to take several goes. But my goal here is to keep in mind the things that have been said by Sterns' friends. Keep in mind that this is essentially hearsay information, but also to see how it measures up against the things that were said by Deb and Chris in this interview. Now, to the best of my knowledge, I'm not sure if anyone's actually gone through and discussed this interview. And I'll explain the reasoning for that as we go further through. But I think it's an important one to look at because I think there's some really revealing things that have been said here. So a huge shout out to Hidden True Crime for actually getting this interview in the first place. Hopefully by doing this I'm not showing any disrespect, because I think that is one of the things why people have steered clear of this interview, is that they are concerned about appearing disrespectful towards Hidden True Crime. Certainly not my intent, so I apologise if that is the interpretation of anyone. So with that said, let's jump in and have a look at the first part of this interview with Chris and Deb Sterns and John and Lauren Matthias.
Hello, Hidden Gems. We are with 2 very important guests today. This is an exclusive interview, and we're going to let them share why they are choosing to do this interview with us, a Hidden True Crime. But we are actually with Deborah and Chris Sterns. Many of you might recognize their names from interviews with police that you've heard, or their names from documents, FOIA documents. They are the parents of Stephen Sterns, who is now behind bars, charged with crimes against Madeline Soto. I'll leave it at that. And I just want to say, no one wants to be in your situation right now. And we are so grateful, though, that you feel safe coming here to Hidden True Crime, to sharing your side of the story and what is going on in your hearts and in your minds. And so with that, why don't we start honestly with sharing what I think many people might be wondering. Why are you choosing to do an interview today?
Well, we've had, first of all, you're thrusted into a limelight that you would never expected to experience in your entire life. I apologize for having Lacey here, but we want to have as much silence as possible from the dogs. We need to bring the ringleader in here. So she's the one that's quite vocal and wants attention. So I apologize. She'll be quiet, hopefully, right, Lacey? Okay. But anyway, no one ever grows up expecting to experience this. You've seen it on the news, you've seen it in the papers, and oh my gosh, how tragic that is. And all of a sudden, you find yourself in the same similar situation. We had provided from the very beginning, proactively very cooperative with the police authorities. I mean, I was caught off guard that Wednesday that Stephen was arrested, not even aware that he was being arrested that evening. I thought I was waiting many hours to have a conversation with the police to learn what was going on, and if I could contribute any information, I would, and not realizing that he was already arrested and actually had been transported away from Orange County down to Osceola County.
Now, so far, there hasn't really been an answer given to the question. The question is, why do you want to do this interview? Now, we can read between the lines of what he's saying here. And basically, he's saying we want to do this interview because we want people to see that we're not the bad guys. I think that's at the base of what they're saying here. So he talks about them being proactive and cooperating with police. But he also talks about being caught off guard with Stefan being arrested. Apparently he didn't see it coming and wasn't expecting Stefan to be arrested. Well, I question that straight up because of the fact that he travelled in the middle of the night to be with Jen and Stefan. Especially because he's then talking to detectives and saying, you know, he spoke to them to see if he could contribute any information. What's curious about that is that this is a guy who lives way away from Jen and Stefan. What information could he possibly have about a missing child unless he believed that Stefan was involved? Otherwise, the story that was being told was that Maddie had been dropped off near the school and had gone missing, possibly abducted from near the school. What information would he have that would actually be helpful in relation to that? Because the only things that he would know about would be Jen or Stefan. According to the narrative, Jen had no involvement whatsoever because she was asleep when Stefan dropped Maddie off at school. So the only information he would have would be about Stefan. Why would you need to give information about Stefan if you believe that he's not involved? It certainly makes you question straight up about his sincerity. So when he says he was caught off guard, is it because he believes that the officers didn't have enough to arrest Stefan, but he knew that Stefan was in trouble? Or does he genuinely mean he was caught off guard because he never imagined that Stefan would have been involved? Don't forget also that the reason Jen and Stefan apparently contacted Chris was because they were being locked out of the townhouse. Stefan had already had a conversation with Chris about his phone being seized. He'd had a conversation with Chris about having a flat tyre and about accidentally resetting his phone and about Maddie being missing. And we've heard from Deb and Chris that they don't trust Stefan. So Chris even says in one interview that he doesn't believe in coincidences, and they were far too many things stacked up one on the other. So to me, him saying he was caught off guard doesn't ring true. I think he was expecting Stefan to be arrested. I think perhaps what he means by being caught off guard is that perhaps he hadn't realised at that point in time that Stefan had unalived Maddie. And perhaps Stefan had given him a story to explain why officers were looking at Stefan. And Chris believed that story, something that made Stefan look less culpable than he was. And perhaps that's what Chris means by caught off guard. Quite simply that Stefan lied to him. He didn't think the situation was nearly as bad as it was. From everything we've heard, it certainly sounds like Deb is usually the one to clean up after Stefan. So perhaps the reason why Chris was summoned there was because maybe they thought he might buy Stefan's story more readily. Because don't forget, Chris was away quite often when Stefan was growing up. So maybe there's a lot of things that Deb covered up that Chris is unaware of. So maybe Stefan believed that he could lie to Chris, give him a partial story that makes Stefan look like he's maybe done something that's a little bit bad, but nothing at all like what he was arrested for. Anyway, let's get on with it.
Never learned until days later that he was arrested. I thought I was just there to help provide some information regarding the disappearance of Maddie. And obviously we learned much later that this turned into something more serious. And we also, at least I thought, and continue to think later with the police interviews here at our home, that our conversation was confidential and certainly wouldn't be released to the public, only to have every word and nuance scrutinized and analyzed and opinions formed about it that is so out of mischaracterizing us and just a lot of speculation and conjectures. So anyway.
Okay, first of all, before I address what he was actually saying there, I just want to point out the non-verbal communication that was just happening there between him and Deb. So she wasn't happy with what he was saying, so she put her hand on him, essentially saying, "Shush, it's my turn to talk." She's stayed silent up until now, and she's pretty much kept a poker face. I would have liked to have been able to see more of what she was doing with her hands at the time, but certainly she has kept a bit of a poker face throughout that. There's a few times when she's looked down or looked off to the side when he was discussing things that were a little bit uncomfortable. Now, we're starting to get more of a glimpse of why they wanted to come on this show. He's talking about interviews with the detectives and saying, well, these were confidential conversations. I had no idea that they would be put out in the public. Well, you live in Florida, you know it's a sunshine state, you know this is a huge case. So would you not expect there to be people making FOIA requests? Would you not expect that sooner or later every interview that's been done is going to come out in public? So they're not liking the way that they are perceived in public based on interviews that were released. Well, I can understand that, but certainly some of the things that were said, there were contradictions. There were some things that to me sounded like out and out lies. And certainly in the June or July interview that he did, he sounded like he was fishing for information. I'm sorry for him that he feels that he's been attacked for that. But at the same time, you know, people have basically reviewed what's been said. Anyway, let's go on and hear what Deb is about to say.
The reason we're doing this today, Lauren and John, is because with the docket dump that went out there, we no longer feel constrained to keep silent and let people keep castigating us and dragging us through the muck for no reason, using lies, conjectures, embroidering facts that they do have, making up facts that they don't. It's become a very incestuous snake pit of lies, innuendo, and just ugliness. And I don't understand why any parent would be subjected to that, because we didn't take part in any of the crimes. Is it a crime to give birth to somebody? I mean, why are we blamed?
Now, I found her reaction to be quite interesting. It seemed a little extreme to me. But that said, I tend to follow creators who don't deal in rumours and speculation and witch hunts and everything like that. But it certainly sounds, from the way she's talking, like there was a witch hunt against her and Chris over Stefan being like what he is. Here's the thing. I think what she is interpreting here is, I know a lot of creators around the time that this interview came out were discussing whether or not her and Chris had basically enabled Stefan throughout his whole life, based on things that had been said in their interviews. Because when you listen to their law enforcement interviews, it certainly sounds like they did enable him, and that it was because of him being so enabled by his parents that he turned out the way he did. It could also be that she is reacting to these interviews that were done on Gray Hughes's channel, because it certainly seems that these friends of Sterns who've come forward have had a lot to say about her. But I don't think anyone has outright said that it is their fault what happened to Maddie. So I wonder if perhaps what she is vocalising here is a bit of a guilty feeling of her own. She has perhaps interpreted what people have said and taken that on board, and maybe she does feel a little bit guilty over Maddie's death because of the way she raised Stefan and because of the things she did for him in the past to cover up for his mistakes. So it could be that while she's claiming that this is coming from content creators and from the public, that there is a little bit of internalized guilt here, which she hasn't fully processed, but makes her more sensitive to comments by people in social media.
Perhaps maybe we need to share something with everyone before we go any further, because it might not be obvious to many watching. Where are you in accepting the reason your son is behind bars? Are you in a place of understanding what he did? Are you believing? Where are you?
Totally.
Yes.
I mean,
Okay.
the last data dump that they had a few weeks ago, and I went through line by line and then shared with Debbie the chronology of the events, the narrative summary and such, that it's very conclusive, and it does, in our mind, indicate Stefan is a lone perpetrator, as much as we want to believe what he said, that there are other people involved. And again, that's out there in a prior phone conversation that Stefan said. But you look at the evidence that's been presented, and it's pretty conclusive that there doesn't appear to be anybody else involved, and that he is the lone perpetrator. And certainly he was guilty of the images that he found on his phone, and then later the charges were expanded to include murder.
Okay, what he did here is really interesting. So Lauren has asked them where they're at with the process of accepting what Stefan did. And they're claiming that they both were like, yeah, we totally accept what he did in terms of they understand that he did the crime. But then Chris goes on to say that certainly now the evidence shows that he was the lone perpetrator. We believe that the evidence is conclusive. And then he says, certainly it appears that he was guilty of the images. What he's saying here is that the evidence shows conclusively that definitely when it comes to the images, they can't argue the point. It appears that he was the lone perpetrator there. But by saying it that way, by saying certainly at the start of that, then he's essentially saying there is doubt over the other allegations. You can be certain about the images, but the other allegations, well, there may be doubt. He's homing in on one thing as a certainty. But I don't believe that they are fully convinced that there wasn't some sort of enterprise going on with the sale of the images that involved more than just Stefan. And I also think that they don't yet believe that Maddie's death can be 100% attributed to Stefan. So it's interesting that what they're saying doesn't quite gel. They're saying they believe that he's responsible. They're saying they've accepted. But I don't think they're really there yet.
Whether it was premeditated, we
You don't think that?
we don't think that. And again, we won't know 100% of the story until if and when he ever provides testimony. But obviously, he was involved in her death, and nobody else was. But I don't want to believe that it was premeditated, but I can't rule that out. But we hold him 100% accountable for his actions, and we obviously are extremely disappointed by that.
So again, they're saying that they hold him 100% accountable for his actions, and they're trying to say that they believe it was all Stefan, but their words don't match. So again, obviously, he was involved with her death, and nobody else was. Well, they can't bring themselves to say that he was responsible for her death. So I think perhaps at the back of his mind at least, or perhaps both of them believe this, that while he was involved in Maddie's death, that it may have been because of somebody else, because of somebody else's actions, or because somebody else said something else. Even with premeditated, he says, we don't believe it was premeditated, but then he even backs off on that and says that he doesn't think it was premeditated. So even though they're trying to say that they have fully accepted Stefan's actions and they fully accept that this was all he's doing, you can tell from the language that they are still struggling here to lay the blame 100% on him and to be able to say that it was all his doing from the start. They say we hold him 100% accountable for his actions, but what actions are they referring to? He hasn't outright said we hold him 100% accountable for Maddie's death. They only hold him accountable for his actions, whatever they are.
Yeah, and I'm sure it's been a process, but in other words, you're learning everything as the public learns it.
Yeah, Yeah, we're not privy to
Nobody's
anything.
giving us a heads up on anything.
Yeah.
That we're mushrooms. We're kept in the dark.
Yeah, the only time we know is all of a sudden we're getting these text messages and heads up alerts from our friends. You go, hey, you got to see this out there. And I go, oh my gosh, what does this mean? I mean, I looking for the news every day, and I don't see anything, and then all of a sudden it's out there, and these videos and YouTube channels have a field day, and it's been that way for weeks ever since. And the challenge is going to be is that we do know that we were told the other day that this is going to be multiple years before it goes to trial.
I think that comment about it being multiple years before it goes to trial gives us some indication of the motivation of Sterns' lawyer with all these motions that she's been putting through. Basically, she's trying to stall the trial. She's already managed to stall the CSAM trial, obviously, for several months. And it sounds like the goal is to also stall the DP trial. Maybe the goal there is to hope that maybe laws will change and the DP will be off the table. Or maybe it's just about, well, I would say it's about income, but I mentioned in another video her office, because it is a public office and because of the amount of money that she already earns, she doesn't get overtime for all the extra hours that she spends working on depositions and stuff, or working on motions, or any of those things that she's been doing. So, you know, I think the thing is here to stall. To try and stall, to try and keep him alive as long as possible, basically.
Given the gravity of the charges and knowing what the penalty is, we're resigned to accept that fate and the fact that we could lose him in a multitude of ways. You know, at any given time, some prisoner in the jail could off him. And you know, we just deal with it on a day-to-day basis. You know, we could get that phone call one day, so we'll wait and see what happens.
I do feel sorry for them. This is not something that you would wish on any parents. Now, I noticed that he said, we are resigned to accept that fate. To me, that says they're resigned to it, but mentally they're still struggling with the concept. So they can't actually name it up. It's just that fate. And then he talks about, well, we could lose him in a multitude of ways, and talks about the possibility of another prisoner unaliving him. And I think, given Stefan's history, that probably is a major concern for them, because they would be aware of how quickly he can fire up. They would be aware of his tendency to cause trouble, to try and stir up fights. They probably half expect him to try and make his own weapon while he's in there, and to come off worse the wear for that. So, yeah, I do feel sorry for them in that respect. There's no handbook that tells you how to be a good parent. And it's easy for us to sit back and say, well, they sucked as parents. It's easy for us to turn around and say, well, she was emotionally abusive, possibly violent. He was absent. But, you know, they're working with what they know as people. So, yes, you face the consequences of your actions, and having this happen to Stefan is the consequence of their actions, the consequence of their parenting, but it still isn't easy on them, that's for sure.
Yeah.
As I told you, I think before, this is the most protracted death of a child that you can go through, because they're already gone to you. We'll never touch him again. We aren't allowed to see him right now. And he's out there, but he's not available. I mean,
Right.
if he'd been hit by a car, it would have been easier on us, because the grieving period could go, instead of grieving for years and years and years while he's still alive and we can't have any access to him.
I find it really interesting that she's describing his situation as being something akin to a protracted death of a child. I can understand on one hand what she means, because obviously they're not going to have any more Christmases with him or celebrate birthdays with him or have him there for afternoon tea for Mother's Day or Thanksgiving or any of those things. But he's still there. And we know that they were having email contact, they were having phone contact. It's interesting that she believes that he wasn't allowed to be in contact with them at that point in time, and we'll come back to that in a little while. But it's just an interesting way of looking at it, that because they don't have physical contact with him or physical access with him, that it's like a protracted death. Well, I mean, I have family who are getting on in age down in other states, and I know that there's a possibility that I might not see them again. But there's a comfort in knowing that they are still there and they're still around. It was the same with my stepmother. She lived in Sydney. I didn't get to see her, I didn't get to share Christmas with her, because obviously to get to Sydney it's quite a long drive, or it's a decent flight. And you've got accommodation, you've got all the costs and everything. But there was comfort in knowing that she was still there. I could still talk to her on the phone. I could still send her things in the mail. So it's just interesting that they see it that way. What I find really interesting, though, is this talk of, had he been hit by a car, it would have been easier. This is so interesting to me, because I think on a subconscious level, it sounds like Deb is admitting that their lives would have been easier had he actually died when he was hit by a car as an 8-year-old. And when you think about it, when you look back, that's before he became an obnoxious teenager, a difficult teenager who they had to cover for. You hear about the violent things he did as a teenager. You hear about her supposedly having to pay off a friend of his because Stefan had been filming the friend's girlfriend. You hear about her friendship essentially ending with the person whose place where she kept her horse, because Stefan had been filming her in the bathroom. You have this incident of Stefan stabbing that man in California, and they hint around it, but I strongly suspect that that is actually the reason they left California. So I think the reason that that has popped into her head, while she may not realise that that's what she is thinking, but on a subconscious level, maybe part of her is thinking, if only he'd been hit by that car and died, and then she could just remember him as the innocent 8-year-old boy who could do nothing wrong in her eyes, and she could wipe the slate clear of all the bad things that he did after that. I'm sure that had she thought about it, she wouldn't have meant to say that, because I think no parent would be wishing that their child had died 30 years earlier. Although, you know, she's an interesting woman, so who knows. But it's definitely very interesting that that's the analogy that she came up with.
Matter of fact, we haven't even heard from him for over 3 weeks now, and we don't know why. I called the other day inquiring about his wellness, and the jail correction officer says, "What does that mean?" I said, "Well, it's a wellness check. We want to find out if he's okay, because we haven't heard from him." "Well, if he wants to talk to you, he'll talk to you." I said, "He wants to talk to us. We don't know of any reason why he wouldn't, unless he's being denied access to communication, which we think he is. And I think it's a result of the most recent data dump, that the guards are intentionally preventing him from getting access to where we can communicate with him. He's in solitary confinement. It's been that way since February, nearly 8 months.
Okay. Wow.
So that's a major allegation to make against guards, to say that the guards aren't allowing him to communicate with them, and that it's all because of the most recent document dump. My thoughts on this, to be completely honest, is when you look at the letters between him and them, and you listen to the phone conversations between him and them, I would imagine that in actual fact his lawyer has said to him, you can't communicate with your parents because you're making yourself look more guilty. There are comments that he has said to his parents which must have the prosecution rubbing their hands with glee. Things that basically amount to confessions, pretty much. So I would imagine that if there's anybody actually restricting him from contacting his parents, then it would actually be his lawyer. Is it possible that he's having a sulk? Well, we heard the phone call where Chris basically said to him, we're in lockdown for 30 days, we can't keep giving you money. Is it possible that the reason they haven't heard from him for 3 months in September was because the money dried up and he had no need for them? Because when you look at his emails between them, most of the time it was him requesting more money for his commissary, more money for books. Please send these books, not these ones. I want to buy more lollies. I want to buy more coffee. It was all about getting money from them. And if they have hit a point where they've said, look, we just can't afford to give you money, maybe he is sulking and not communicating with them for that reason, because there's nothing in it for him. He can't get money out of them, he can't get books out of them, so why communicate? So I think they are the two more likely scenarios. Either his lawyer has told him to shut up, or he's sulking because he's not getting money or books or anything out of them anymore. Now, can we please address this comment of solitary confinement? When an inmate such as Stephen Sterns becomes incarcerated, they have to be kept in isolation, because otherwise they would be dead within a month. In any prison, any jail, people such as Stephen are the lowest of the low. They are the scum of the earth, and they will be a target if they are out in general population. There will be a shiv or two with their name on it. But isolation is not solitary confinement. There is a huge difference. Isolation means that they are in a single cell of their own. They're not sharing a cell with anyone. they're not using the exercise yard at the same time as other inmates. They may be in isolation, I don't know. Maybe there is a common area where a handful of inmates who are in isolation are allowed to exist for brief periods of time. In his case, I doubt it. But he would not be confined to his cell. He would be allowed out of his cell for exercise. He would not be denied of privileges. If someone is in solitary confinement, they lose all privileges. They can't buy things for themselves. He wouldn't be able to buy his lollies and his coffee and whatever else he buys. They don't have phone rights. They certainly wouldn't have iPad rights or whatever the tablet is that he was using to communicate with his parents. None of those things are given to someone in solitary confinement. Someone in solitary confinement basically has to stay in their cell probably 23 hours of the day. They lose all privileges until they are allowed out of solitary confinement. It is a form of punishment. Isolation, they are allowed full privileges. It just means that they are being kept safe away from other prisoners. Huge difference. We know that from what Paula has said, that he has been cleared to actually work within the jail, which means that he can now earn an income for himself. Like, I think it's probably only a couple of dollars a day or something, but it's an income that he can then use to buy things for himself. If he was in solitary confinement, he wouldn't be able to do that either. Basically, he would just get whatever the standard daily allowance is that prisoners get. Presumably that is how it also works there in the United States. So, no, he was not in solitary confinement. He is not in solitary confinement. He's in isolation for his own protection.
Wow. And yeah, I remember you telling us that in an earlier conversation too, that it would be easier almost it would be easier to mourn his death than this, because you also have to realize and mourn Madeline, who you knew as well.
The whole thing we do, and we're accused of being cold and impartial people. And I mean, they made a big deal of the fact that I went outside and was screaming Madeline's name. I wasn't looking for her in the woods. I was talking to God. That's my privilege, to talk to my God. I was asking, why Madeline, and where is she?
And yet the report from Northport PD says that basically she told them the reason she was outside and pretty much hysterical, and that it took her quite some time to calm down, was because she found a sex doll, in Stefan's room. So she's now changing the story here. Is it to elicit sympathy? Is it to try and cover up the fact that she was a little bit disturbed by what she found in his room? Don't know, but it is a red flag for me that she has to change the story here. And it seems to me that this may be because of the criticism of her. So now she wants to create the impression of someone who is deeply religious, as opposed to the parent who found a sex doll in her son's bedroom and was disturbed by it because maybe she thought it was Maddie.
I'm sorry.
But we, every day.
We see her getting emotional here for the first time. And this is after her directly saying about the incident of being outside and calling for Maddie and saying, I'm allowed to call to my God, why Maddie? But given the alternate story, I'm wondering if the reason she's upset there is a bit of a trauma response to having discovered the doll in Stefan's room. And maybe that still gets her shaken up when she thinks about it. Because that would be the forefront of her mind, I think. She's talking about a particular incident, and the emotional reaction is to that incident. It's not a reaction to Maddie.
All of this is in our minds. We talk about it often, and we're private people. We keep our emotions to ourselves as best as possible, but we certainly, there's no way that this will escape us on a daily basis. It's impossible for that to happen. We're forever living with this, and I just wish there was. I just wish there was a way that we could have possibly known that there was a problem going on with Stefan. I had no idea.
Yeah.
The only thing that we knew that was wrong, and we addressed it immediately, was when we became aware of the co-sleeping arrangements. And they were here at our house. And at that point, I put my foot down and said, Madeline's not sleeping in the room with you. She's too old for that. And I said, you need to stop doing that at home too. And I talked to both Jen and to Stefan. And Jen says, well, she comes in at night. She gets scared. She comes in at night and climbs into bed, and I can't stop her. I said, does your door have a lock on it? She said, yes. I said, well, then use the damn lock.
So you have Chris saying that, I wish there was some way we could have known that there was a problem with Stefan. But straight up, Deb basically makes a liar of him, because she then starts talking about the co-sleeping arrangements. So essentially, he said, I wish we'd have known there was a problem, and straight away she's flagging up the problem. We knew that they were sleeping together. She's basically saying we knew there was a problem and we didn't do anything about it. I find it really disturbing, even with a 12-year-old, 13-year-old child, that anyone would suggest to a mother that they should lock their bedroom door overnight and not allow their child access to their room. What if there's an emergency? What if that child really desperately needs the parent's help and they've basically been locked out? What sort of trauma would that cause? It comes down to teaching the child coping strategies for learning to sleep on their own, and locking them out of the parent's bedroom is bordering on neglect. It just, I can remember very few occasions as a child when I would have gotten up through the night and gone into my parents' bedroom, but I think we can all think back to at least one or two times as a child or as a young teen when we may have needed to do so. What if Maddie was bleeding and needed help? What would she do? Because the way Jen sleeps, supposedly, banging on the door might not make any difference, but actually being able to go into the room. And I'm sorry, but that downstairs bathroom, isn't that the bathroom that Maddie used? It's my understanding. I know at one point in time you have the flatmate, or you have Jen saying that the flatmate didn't like Stefan using the upstairs bedroom, but she did say we, as in we don't use the upstairs bedroom, meaning that, if Maddie was downstairs and she woke up through the night and needed to use the bathroom, what would she have to do? It just makes me cringe to hear this woman suggest Lock your kid out of the bedroom. Fix the problem that way. Make yourself no longer accessible for the child. It's not the solution.
I mean, it's ridiculous. And then to send your child off to sleep with a man in another room in a single bed together, who is not a biological relative, and even biological relatives can't be trusted. I mean, seriously, how many people have you heard of in that situation with family members? So I just, I saw red when I heard that, and it's.
Did you, on that issue, did you? I know you. It sounds like you chastised them about sleeping in the same bed, but did you ever get a chance to sit down and talk to Stefan about that issue in more detail?
I didn't think I had to. I did not think I had to.
Well,
but I did bring Madeline in, and she stayed with me in my room anytime they came to visit.
That makes me so angry. On one hand, she claims that she saw red when she realised that Stefan and Jen had Maddie sleeping with them in the same bed. And yet, when John asks her if she spoke to him about it, she's like, I didn't think I had to. She didn't think she has to follow up on a young child sharing a bed between her mother and a male, an adult male. She didn't think she needed to follow up on that. Well, I'm sorry, Deborah Sterns, but you hold part of the responsibility for Maddie's death. I'm just going to say it outright. Every single person who saw something wrong and held their tongue owns a little piece of responsibility for Maddie's death. There's this idea that, oh, it's not my place to say anything. I don't want to offend. I don't want to be rude. I don't want to make them angry. Maddie is the reason why we all need to reconsider. Next time people get into a position where they see something that is wrong like this, I hope that there's going to be people out there who think about Maddie's situation and realise if you see something, say something. Because there are so many missed opportunities here that could have made a world of difference for Maddie. She turned her back on Maddie, essentially. This whole, not my problem, I didn't think I had to say anything, it's not good enough. It's that sort of attitude that costs the Maddies of the world. Sorry to get fired up, but that is one of the comments made by her that just makes me so angry. As for her having Maddie sleeping in her room, I really don't like that. And I'll talk more on that in a moment.
Right. Yeah, you guys said that in one of your interviews that she was in. Was it both of you guys' bed, or was it?
No, we are what they call now sleep divorced. We have separate rooms because we can't sleep together. We love each other, absolutely.
She's insomniac and a night person. I'm a morning person, and
we both snore.
And so it would be the battle of the lumberjacks. And so, in order for both of us to get sleep, we sleep in separate rooms, and we sleep with the dogs.
We split the dogs up.
We call the bitches and bros. I get the boys, she gets the girls. And they provide warm comfort, and they're
security.
They're great sleep mates. So, and of course, and if I'm not here, they all sleep with Debbie. And God forbid somebody try to come in the house, they're going to have 5 Doberman pinchers with hair on their ass. going after them. They'll tear them a new one. So warning, heads up.
Yeah, to all those YouTubers, we'll get into that too.
So it sounds like they may be a little bit wigged out about strangers making threats after what Stefan did. And I can't blame them for feeling a bit nervous about that, if that's what the warning is with regards to the dogs. But they're saying they're sleep divorced because of the snoring or yada yada. But here's the thing. You have Stefan's friend saying that they essentially haven't slept together for a very, very, very long time. It sounds like it's now just a marriage of convenience. So, for some reason, they just decided it was just probably financial reasons. It was easier to stay together. Now, one thing that I hadn't actually put much thought into until now, she's talking about Maddie sleeping with her. And she means Maddie actually sleeping in her bed with her. But now they're also saying that the dogs sleep with them as well. Now, first of all, I feel uncomfortable with Maddie sleeping in a bed with any adult that's not her own parent. Personally, I feel uncomfortable with any child over the age of about 6 regularly sleeping in bed with an adult. They need their own bed, they need their own space, they need to be able to self-soothe and learn to sleep on their own. Now, if she's so determined to have Maddie separate from Stefan and Jen while she's there, first of all, it's a bit hypocritical if she was then going to just send Maddie back home with them anyway, knowing that the rest of the time Maddie would still be sleeping with them. If you dislike it that much, then you need to take positive action, like all round, not just a band-aid. When you're here, you have to sleep in my bed, but when you go home, it's okay, I'll let you sleep with Stefan again. That's just wrong. But if she's so determined to have Maddie not sleep with Jen and Stefan when under her roof, then she should be buying a little trundle bed or a little air bed, like a little Lilo or something, and allow Maddie to at least have her own bed to sleep on, even if she sleeps in the same room as Deb. Because I think back to when I was Maddie's age, and I would have been horrified to have been expected to sleep in a bed with an adult who wasn't even a blood relative. Heck, I would have been horrified to have slept in a bed with my mother or my grandmother. It's just, the way they treated this poor girl is just horrid.
But Debbie did talk to Stefan and Madeline individually, and
together.
Yeah, it didn't. So
I think it went in one ear and out the other because they didn't stop, but they never got to do it here.
Chris just completely contradicted her. She's like saying she didn't speak to Stefan because she didn't think she had to. And then he says, yeah, but we spoke to, or they're saying, he said we spoke to Stefan and Maddie. I'm not sure if he meant Maddie or if he meant Jen. Well, either you did or you didn't. Sounds like he is the spin doctor in the relationship here. He is saying the things that he believes are meant to be said, the things that people want to hear. And perhaps Deb is forgetting to turn the filter on and accidentally letting out things that possibly they didn't want to say publicly. But saying, well, you know, we spoke to them and it was in one ear, out the other because it didn't stop. But it didn't happen here. It's like she's excusing herself. I did my responsibility. I spoke to them, and I know that they didn't stop doing it, but I didn't allow it here at my place, so that's fine. It's not fine. If you have said to someone, it is not appropriate for your 10, 11, 12-year-old daughter to be sharing a bed with you and a partner, in between you and your partner, and you know that they've ignored you suggesting that, and that they've gone home and they've continued to do that, then the next step is to call Children's Protective Services. And had she done that, Maddie could still be alive today. Essentially saying that you're off the hook because you didn't allow it at your own house, that's complete utter bullshit.
And I did not. And then we were chastised because we didn't allow them to vape in our home, and somehow they figured out that we don't smoke. We only drink occasionally. I can't turn down a margarita at a Mexican restaurant, and we don't do drugs. I don't even like doing prescribed drugs. That I won't take pain pills. I did the whole heart surgery on nothing but extra strength Tylenol. I can't take it. Some of it I'm allergic to, but they said we thought we were superior because of that. That's not true. That's our choice. But also my choice is I don't want cigarette smoke and marijuana smoke in my home. It makes me ill. I don't like the smell of it. I don't want to be around it.
Now, I'm not sure where she's coming from in terms of the being very, very strong about I don't do drugs of any sort, not even prescription drugs. Maybe it is just something that she feels strongly about, or maybe it is connected to Stefan's own activities, his preference for all sorts of drugs. We know that he is clearly for a long time been a fan of the old MJ, and who knows what else he was getting into. And boy, must it suck for him now being in jail and not having access to any of those things. So it could be a response to having a son who's a bit of a druggie, or it could just be some people just are like that. They just have an aversion to any sorts of drugs, and they get it in their head that even Panadol's bad for you. I mean, my thoughts are, at the end of the day, something's going to kill you. Sorry, I shouldn't be so sarcastic. As for smoking or vaping in the house, look, I can't blame her. If I had someone come to my house and they wanted to smoke or vape, I would certainly be asking them to do so outside. I think in this day and age, it's just not etiquette these days to smoke or vape inside someone else's house.
It sounds like, Deborah, that Madeline occasionally was in your bed. Did you guys have a close relationship with Madeline? Could you talk about that for a minute?
Yes, I taught her to crochet. We sat and did artwork together. We did projects. I was teaching her how to cook. She spent a lot of time with me when she wasn't in there watching movies with them. So we actually put Disney on our TV here so she could sit out in the family room with us while I thought we were giving Jen and Stefan alone time as a couple.
So look, I will give her credit for coming up with enrichment activities for Maddie, crochet, art, projects and stuff. But that doesn't necessarily show that you are close with a child. That just shows that you've done things with them. You can be fond of a child and do those sort of things with them. You could also be a grumpy ass person who does those sort of activities with them and criticises them for not doing things right. So I would have expected with him asking her if they were close, to hear more sort of personal things about a personal connection. Maybe comments that Maddie had made that showed that she felt close to Deb, or the emotions, the connections that were made, not doing things with people. because there's a difference. And, you know, maybe she did feel close to Maddie, and maybe Maddie felt close to her, but she's not demonstrating that here. And I noticed also when she was reeling off all the activities, she was actually very slowly shaking her head. Now, it could be that she was just thinking in her mind the things that they did, so that's what the head movement was. She was kind of ticking them off in her mind, and maybe her head was moving because of that. Or maybe the shaking the head was, well, we did these things but we weren't close. I'm not sure. You would have to get to know her other tells. You would have to get a feel for her to know what her tells are with her body language. She really doesn't seem to give away a lot with her body language, as far as I can tell.
I tried to be respectful of their space.
Yeah.
Taking on Madeline, but Madeline was an absolute joy. The girl was happy, precocious, smiling. She walked with a bounce. She was interested in everything. She
Giggled a lot.
She giggled a lot. This is a horrible loss in the world. That child, she should still be here. She should still be here.
Yeah.
I will give her this. Her and Juan are the only two people who I've seen show genuine emotion for Maddie. Now, for her, this is probably complicated emotion, knowing that this little girl who she must have felt some attachment to was unalived by her own son. And for all we know, the emotion could be the horror over the fact that it was her son who did that. The sense of horror, betrayal over what he did. So, I mean, at the appropriateness of it, it seems like she is definitely distraught over Maddie's death. But at the same time, I wonder how much of that is also over the consequences of Maddie's death. The fact that it has basically destroyed their lives, it's destroyed Stefan's life. And there's a lot that has come as a result of her death. I think her saying, you know, she should still be here today shows that she genuinely did care about Maddie and that she genuinely is upset about Maddie. But definitely there'd have to be even more weighing on her in terms of that sense of overwhelm and the sense of just being so sad over the situation.
Did you, so you just described kind of the bright side of Madeline, that she was happy and giggled a lot. Did you ever, you know, she was next to you in bed. Did you ever notice any distress?
No.
From her? Did you ever feel like maybe she wanted to talk to you about something she couldn't, or did you get any of that?
There was none of that. In fact, just the opposite. Stefan would be sitting on the sofa, and she would go and sit on the arm of the sofa and break her arm around him and give him a kiss and tell him she loved him. You know, and Madeline is the one that told me about the co-sleeping. Not Stefan and not Jim. Madeline did. When she related, she said it was a funny story. She says, "Oh, I was in bed with Mom and Stefan, and when I woke up in the morning, my leg was draped over him." And she went, "Isn't that funny?" I said, "No, it's not. I don't find that funny."
Yeah.
That's right. When I would have to talk with them. Because to me, I'm sorry, that sent up a big red flag.
Yeah.
So the question was if she ever saw any signs of distress in Maddie. And she knew that it was related to what was going on with Stefan, clearly. And then she brings up two incidents that to me are huge red flags, and yet she never acted on them. She makes this whole thing of her sitting on the arm of the sofa and putting her arm around Stefan and kissing him and telling him she loves him, she makes that sound like, oh, that's just a sweet little thing that kids do. Had I seen someone else's daughter do that with an adult male that was not their biological father, straight up, that would have been a huge red flag for me. I would have had to have said something then and there. And I sure as hell would have reported it. But she thought that was cute. She thought that was sweet. And then she goes on to talk about the story of Maddie having her leg over Stefan in the bed. And she even refers to it as a red flag. And says, well, that's when I had the talk with them. And yet the result of that talk, as she tells us, was that nothing changed. It just breaks my heart that this woman could have made a difference. It shouldn't matter if it's your own son or if it's your son's girlfriend. When a child is involved, you need to step up and do the right thing. And she chose not to.
She
Never.
said that in a playful manner,
Yes.
but not in a, you wouldn't see that as kind of a cry for help.
I did not see it as a cry for help. I found it to be disturbing to me on levels. So other than that, we had no recollection. We had no indication that anyway that something illicit was going on. Nothing.
Yeah.
Now, I know it's his job, and that part of what John was doing there was he didn't want to sound like he was judging Deb for not reacting to what occurred. And he is giving her an out. And you didn't see that as a cry for help. And he didn't say it in an accusatory way. And she said, no, I didn't see it as a cry for help. I'd be hopeless doing his job because I would be far more accusatory in that. I'm like, what the heck were you doing? Why didn't you realise that was a cry for help? How could you do that to, I would lose the plot with this woman. And yet he has clarified quite clearly her thinking without sounding accusatory, even though I can imagine what's going on in his mind. She does, though, after he's asked her about if she believed it was a cry for help, she then says that it was disturbing to her on so many levels. Okay, so you find it disturbing that this child is relating an instance where she basically ended up on top of your adult son in bed. You find that disturbing on so many levels, but you didn't consider it to be a cry for help. I think we just really need to just keep telling Maddie's story and just try to get Maddie's message out there that if something's not right, you need to act on it. Don't turn around and be afraid of insulting someone. Don't be afraid of sticking your head in when no one else wants to. Because it could make a difference if you speak up. Sorry, I know I sound like a bit of a Debbie Downer, but it just frustrates me with Maddie's case when I hear comments like this from people who could have made a difference for her.
And when you told Stefan you shouldn't be co-sleeping with Madeline, he, as far as you could tell, he heard you. He said, okay.
He heard me. He and Jen both says, well, but she wants to be with us. And
Yeah.
I knew no matter what I said to him, they're going to do what they're going to do anyway.
That does not absolve her of any responsibility. If you see something that is that bad, something that is disturbing to you on so many levels, and you know that even though you spoke to them about it, nothing is going to change, that doesn't end your involvement there. That's when you escalate it for the sake of the child. It just makes me so mad that she is basically justifying her inaction by saying, well, I said something to them and they didn't do anything. So there you are, I did something, I reacted. What more do you expect? It's really poor, in my opinion.
It was very obvious to me that they were not listening. They heard, but they're not comprehending, and they're not going to change.
You've mentioned that Stefan would often say one thing but do another, right? That you didn't know.
Oh yeah, modus operandi.
You didn't know what was true and what wasn't sometimes.
I mean,
He made it. He was a gaslighter. You know, he could make you think things were one way when they were a total other way, and do it with such sincerity that you questioned yourself.
Interesting.
And when we got to figure that out, things changed for him, and they didn't change for the good. And he was no longer a happy camper because we challenged him on everything. We came up missing money. We came up missing jewelry. Came up missing my deceased father's Rolex. And I know he took it, but he won't admit to it even now.
When did that start? Could you tell us a little bit about the line, when it started, and when like when did he take the Rolex?
Last year.
It started when he was a teenager.
Okay.
And little stuff, and then they got bigger and bigger as he got older. I mean, you never got the truth about anything. I mean, he wrecked his car and never got the true story in that.
I can't help thinking, based on the things that she said, just based on her personality, that Deb herself is a bit of a gaslighter. So I find it amusing that she's accusing Stefan of being a gaslighter. I'd imagine he is, and we know he's a huge liar. And I think what they're saying now, what they're talking about, is giving us a clue with regards to my thoughts, where I've said where I believe that they did help him out after Maddie went missing. And I strongly believe that he's lied to them. He's given them some sort of whack job story where maybe he did something not so bad as what he actually did, and they've jumped in to help him and then discovered what he actually did. When she's saying that he lies to them and they challenge him on everything, I wonder if they did challenge him on everything. I think as a teenager he got away with a lot of things. And it's interesting, when asked when did that start, Deb says last year, and Chris says as a teenager. So maybe it's only recently that she's become aware. Maybe there was something that was so glaringly obvious, like her watch going missing or something, that made her suddenly realise what he was like and how much of a liar he was. Whereas it sounds like Chris is aware of the fact that Stefan's always been like that. Now, can we just acknowledge, well, we know that he does spend a lot of money on toys. They're saying that he's been basically stealing from him and stuff since he was a teenager. People who have drug addictions will so often steal from family as well. So I wonder how much money, how many of the things that he was stealing from him were for drugs and how many were for his ridiculous toys. Just a thought, something to mull over.
So very similar to the incident of Maddie's disappearance. Coming up with something like that.
Now I'm going to butt in there before he goes off on a tangent, because I know that he does. When you take that one statement on its own, especially after him saying he wrecked his car and lied about it, we don't know what really happened, and now he's relaying that to Maddie's disappearance, saying it is very similar, coming up with something like that. Okay, so coming up with what about Maddie's disappearance? Something like that about Maddie's disappearance. He's just said he wrecked his car and lied about it, and now he's saying that Stefan came up with some sort of lie about Maddie's disappearance. Well, yes, we could just take it on face value and go, well, yeah, he lied about dropping Maddie off at school and her going missing from there. But I can't help thinking, I still believe that what has occurred with the Stearnses is that Stefan did contact them and say Maddie's missing, and that the detectives are looking at me because of something, even if it's just, I think the detectives are going to look at me because I accidentally factory reset my phone and now they're going to think I'm guilty or something like that. Like I said, I think he gave them some sort of inane story and they jumped to action. So for Chris to be coming up with something like that in relation to Maddie's disappearance when he's just spoken about lying about wrecking his car, it makes me question. It certainly does.
When he called me that afternoon, second call that day, flat tire, and listened to that BS. And boy, when you look at the images of that tire, I mean, there wasn't hardly any rubber left on that wheel whatsoever. And then they show pictures of these chunks of rubber laying in the ground. And Stefan trying to explain to me that he had a flat tire and he was in the inside lane of a highway in a high density commercial district and he couldn't pull off the road. Again, it was a story that I didn't believe, and then getting a call 90 minutes later, less than 90 minutes later, about Maddie's disappearance, and I go, that's too coincidental. Two events like that in a single afternoon. Don't believe in coincidences. Didn't believe that, but wanted to. I was there to support the story until it was different. And
again, he was there to support the story until it was different. To support what story? I've said this a million times. I just cannot understand the reason for driving to Orlando in the middle of the night just to speak with them for 10 minutes and go to bed. Why not just have a decent night's sleep and drive there early in the morning? He's like an early riser. He could have got up at 6:30 and headed that way at 6:30 and still been there before they got out of bed. So what was he there to support this? Why was he there to support the story? Why did he go to Orlando? I just think there's definitely something that's not being said here, especially when he claims that he doesn't believe in coincidences. So the flat tire and Maddie going missing, he thought there was something wrong there, but then he still supported the story. And the other curious thing is that he says that the flat tire, the phone call about the flat tire, was the second phone call from Stefan. But he doesn't say what the first phone call was, which is also really, really curious. So Stefan called him about something during the day. He then called him later about a flat tire, and then called him after that to say Maddie was missing. So what was the thing that he called him for before calling about the flat tire? Did Chris just misspeak here and he meant that he made 2 phone calls? One was the flat tire, one was Maddie missing, or was there another phone call before the flat tire? I'm just trying to wrap my head around this, and I do feel that there are gaps here in what we are being told.
Unfortunately, I found out a couple of days later, if I had seen that TV interview that they held the next day, my attitude and demeanor with him would have been considerably different than me making the trip to Orlando and helping he and Maddie out, or Jennifer out, for sure.
The police kicked everybody out of the townhouse and quarantined it, roped it off. They had no money. They had no place to go. He didn't want to go to the in-laws' house, of course, or to her mother's house. They got along like oil and water. But it was, Chris went there to get them into a hotel and to be there as emotional support for them for a missing child, not for anything else.
Not for an escape route or to hide them.
Nope.
You knew that Madeline was missing. You didn't know why. And you thought, I can give them a place to stay.
Okay, what they just said there and the interaction that occurred between them tells me that they were both in on this. So I've been, tossing back and forth between, well, we know that Deb had covered for Stefan in the past. Maybe the idea was to get Chris away from the house so Deb could help Stefan get into the house for some reason, and Chris knows nothing about it. And then the thought was maybe Chris went up there and Deb just slept through the whole event and knew nothing. But what occurred here is that he's basically saying that had he seen that TV interview before the trip to Orlando, that he wouldn't have made the trip to Orlando. He wouldn't have, his attitude and his demeanour would have been very different. Well, he didn't say there a specific reason for making the trip to Orlando. He left that open. But then Deb butts in. She puts her hand on him to tell him to stop. And the reason for that being, I believe that she realised that he was essentially saying that he did get sucked in by Stefan's lies, and he went to Orlando to help Stefan out with something. To help Stefan out because Stefan was being looked at by detectives. But Deb stopped him. She put her hand on him to stop him. And she comes up with the story, which we know is not true, saying that they had no money and no place to go. Why do we know that's not true? Well, we know that because Chris actually discussed that with the detectives. The detectives asked him outright, did you pay for the hotel room? And he said no. They paid for their hotel room and I paid for the dog. And then he corrects himself and he says, well, actually, they paid for the dog and then I reimbursed them. So it's really, really clear that he did not need to go up there to get them into a hotel, to help them find a place to go. They found the money for that. They did that themselves. He could have reimbursed them without going up there, because it's not like he even had to pay a hotel at that point. So he made a trip up there. He had the cost of fuel. He had the cost of a hotel room for himself. And he's saying he wouldn't have done that had he seen that interview. Meaning that Stefan hoodwinked him. After Deb puts out this whole story, the same story as Jen, that Chris went there to pay for the hotel, Chris doesn't actually correct her. He allows Lauren to believe that, and Lauren even essentially clarifies that. And there's no correction. Now, I will give them their dues. Hidden True Crime, I don't think they really deep dive cases like this as much as some of us do. So they may not have heard that interview where Chris admits that, no, he didn't pay for the hotel room. Or it could be that they simply don't want to get them offside, and they want the interview to continue smoothly. Either way, that one bit of interaction, that one conversation, to me shows me that both Deb and Chris were involved in whatever they were doing to cover up for Stefan. Deb knows Chris didn't pay for the hotel room, but Chris didn't correct her. And the way he said that his attitude and demeanour would have been different had he had a heads up already in terms of that TV interview, says to me that he was hoodwinked by Stefan. That Stefan did lie to them and give them some far more inane version of what was going on, where Stefan was still in trouble for something, but where Stefan had nothing to do with Maddie's disappearance or her death. And I don't know if maybe Chris was previously aware of Stefan's interest in photographs, and maybe Stefan spoke about that and said that he'd reset his phone and he's worried about getting into trouble for that. Who knows?
Yeah, and then I wanted some quality time with him, again, I just kicked myself for not seeing that TV interview, because my conversation would have been.
It was after. You couldn't have seen it.
I know that, but the interview took place before I got up there.
Yeah.
That's the thing, but I didn't find out about it till Friday, and it happened on Tuesday. But my conversation with him would have been very confrontational. And I wouldn't have been satisfied until I got the truth from him. When I questioned him as best as I could, now that he was in incarceration, obviously he couldn't give me the answers. The best he could come up with is that I wasn't able to think. Well, he was thinking a lot of other things and taking a lot of actions and doing a lot of things that obviously he was thinking. But again, that would be an appropriate response from Stefan, because again, keep telling the lie.
I notice how she's just glaring at him the whole time. She doesn't like that he is basically jumping Stefan in it completely. She's really not a fan of that. She was actually quite rude to him there when he's talking about how he wished he'd seen that interview. He wanted quality time and his questions would have been different. And she's quite rude the way, well, you couldn't have seen it because it was after. I think that shows what we've heard from friends of Stefan, that basically she is perhaps not the nicest person in their relationship. And it sounds to me that she is perhaps a little bit dismissive of him, a little bit passive aggressive towards him. And yeah, I think that he's there's probably a little bit of verbal emotional abuse in their relationship, and clearly we know that also carries over to Stefan. But it certainly seems to me that there is not necessarily an even relationship between those two. But everything Chris is saying here says to me that he was given a very, very different impression in terms of the reasoning for going to Orlando, which obviously makes sense. So I do believe that he had no idea that Stefan had unalived Maddie. But I suspect that they did give the impression that Stefan was in trouble. And perhaps Stefan made up something that sounded not nearly as bad to get Chris to help him. I know I'm sounding a bit vague there, but if you check out my other Chris Sterns, Deb Sterns videos, then you'll understand what I'm going at with that. It's kind of deep and complicated.
But the amount of time that I have from 2:15 Wednesday morning until 4 p.m., I spent a total of 35 minutes with him, and it was over 3 different occasions. First of all, find that he wasn't at the hotel that morning, and then to learn later that he had left that hotel, went to St. Cloud, went to Northport, and came back, and then obviously so exhausted he passed out in bed, didn't see him again until 3 o'clock, and again, no time for conversation because now we're down in the lobby of the hotel, and he's now being escorted to supposedly a press conference, which there was a press conference, but he was immediately taken to the rear of the sheriff's department and put in a detention room, and later that evening arrested. Never had a chance to have a conversation with him.
Okay.
So I believe what he's saying there about not really getting much of a chance to have a conversation with Stefan. We know from the data from the doors that he only spent about 10 minutes with Stefan and Jen when he arrived early in the morning. We also know, according to Jen, that Stefan went to the room after he returned from his early morning drive and basically crashed out and slept pretty much all day. But what's interesting here is that Chris says he only got to spend about 35 minutes with them, meaning both of them, and he's essentially saying here that he didn't have a chance to talk to Stefan about anything because he only had 35 minutes with them. But can we just recognise here that Jen and Stefan spent 4 hours sitting in Jen's car before they were officially thrown out of the townhouse. And during that period of time, that's when they rang Chris and arranged for him to come to Orlando. So how much time did they spend talking during that 4-hour period of time with Chris? So he could have had conversations with them beforehand. But the other thing is, where he's saying he only had 35 minutes with them, when you listen to Jen's interviews, in one of her interviews, she talks about her and Chris actually Chris bought her lunch or something, and then they went and took lunch for Stefan, and Stefan only ate a few bites. But the way Jen's talking gave me the impression that her and Chris spent quite a bit of time together during that particular day while Stefan was sleeping, meaning that even if he didn't have much of a conversation while he was in Orlando with Stefan, it sounds like him and Jen had plenty of time to speak with each other. He checked out of his hotel at, I think, 8 p.m. that evening. I don't know if he probably then returned to Northport. Jen's interview must have finished. Now, her interview was at 3, and I'm not sure how long it was, but it wasn't 5 hours. And he did mention in one interview that he drove Jen to her sister's place. So when you start putting all that together, he's had plenty of time to talk to Jen about the situation. So saying that implying that he hadn't had time to talk with them as opposed to having time to talk with Stefan isn't quite accurate. And I'm wondering if that is intentional, the way he's saying that.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there was some issue about one YouTuber who called out Chris as a liar because he said he saw a picture on the phone.
Yeah, much later, I mean, I'm having a conversation again, thinking I'm having a private conversation with the deputies back in July. And, Jen that evening had provided some very graphic detail of the image. She told me in her story was that there was a group of photos that they had downloaded off of Stefan's phone. They wanted to show these images, this package of images to Jennifer. She said that she couldn't see them, but agreed to look at one. Then she shared with me in graphic detail what that image was. 5 months later, I'm thinking throughout that time that she had the opportunity to maybe grab a photo of that, and because once you describe that to me, I can't get it out of my mind. It becomes ingrained and printed, and I'm thinking that there's an image in my mind that I must have seen a photo, and instead of asking a question, I made a comment to the police, and then one of these YouTubers accused me of lying and making this stuff up, and it was really my bad. I apologize. I thought it was an image I saw when in fact it was a graphical image in my mind, but I thought I'd seen a photo. So I apologize for that. But
Okay, I actually find what he's saying there quite disturbing, which he wouldn't like, clearly, because clearly other people have said that. But he's talking about where in the July interview where he claimed that Jen had shown him images, and he told the officers that, and tried to find out if Jen was involved, I think. And the officers told him quite clearly that Jen didn't have any images and they had completely downloaded her phone, and if there were any images they would have found them. And now he's saying that Jen had actually described the image that she saw in such graphic detail that he believed that he saw it. Now, I've got so many issues with that. Hopefully, Jen did not describe that in such graphic detail, because if she did, that just shows how much of a weird-ass sick woman she is. Because I think most parents, well, any normal mother, had they been shown an image of their daughter doing particular acts with her mouth with a male, because I believe that's the image that from thinking back to the interviews, because remember she said she didn't think that was actual grapes because it wasn't that other sort of action. It is so hard because I know YouTube will just whack me and demonetize me if I say it the wrong way. So I hope you're following the gist of what I'm saying. So, are you telling me that Jen actually described that in detail to the father of the pervert who did that to her daughter, when in another interview she's saying, I haven't even spoken to Chris and Deb because I know too much? Well, someone's lying here. The other issue I have with it is that regardless of whether or not Jen provided full details, to actually jump to the point where you can fully visualize it in your head, that's not normal, if you ask me. You would remember it had you physically seen the image. But to hear a description of an image such as that, you wouldn't jump from hearing a description of an image such as that to believing that you saw it unless you had a reference image in your mind already. And I'm not going to go further on that. I'll let you think about what I'm saying there, because I don't want to be too triggering, and I also don't want to be demonetized. But it just seems odd that he's claiming, especially with comments later on relating to the USB drives, but it seems odd to claim that he believed he saw the images because of how detailed Jen's description was. The description from Jen, if it was detailed, that makes her a complete utter pervert, because most parents wouldn't even be able to cope with the concept. And if it wasn't detailed from Jen, well, then he clearly had a reference image in his head that he has overlaid, essentially, over what Jen has told him. I'm not going to go further with that. So that brings us up to, we're getting up towards 2 hours, and I'm only a quarter of the way through this interview, so I'm going to leave it at that. Let me know down below if you are keen for me to continue having a look at this interview. It certainly starts to get more interesting when they're talking about younger Stefan and his girlfriends and stuff like that. There are some parts that I might just edit out for later on in the interview because I think they're just not overly relevant. But I mean, I'm keen to continue and do some more of this if you are interested. But I will definitely leave it at that for today. So thanks for listening. If you are new to my channel, please subscribe. Also, please hit the like button. YouTube loves it when you do that and helps me get more people seeing my videos. And leave a comment below. Let me know your thoughts on what I've discussed here in this video today. Thank you, and I'll catch you in the next one.